I think the most important C# project type to learn is the class library project type. That's the project type that should store most of your real code. However, the second most important project type, in my opinion, is Web API. Yep, I think it's that important. In today's fast-paced culture where new user interfaces are popping up all over, Web API can be a constant. It allows you to put all of your business logic, data access, and more behind an interface that just about anything can use. You want a JavaScript-powered website for a front end? Not a problem if you're using Web API. You want to add iOS and Android applications that have the same functionality as your desktop application? Again, not a problem. The boss decides to change from a WinForm application over to a Ruby-powered website? That's just user interface work, if you're using Web API. Do you get the picture? Web API is a big deal. In case you didn't know, I am Tim Corey, and in this video, I'm going to introduce you to Web API. Once we get a Web API project up and running, I'm going to give you a tour of what is possible. Really, the basics of Web API are fairly simple. Next, I'll show you a tool you can use to test your API without needing a front end. And finally, I'll show you a few tips to help make your first API even better. So let's get started. Now here I'm running Visual Studio 2017, and it's actually the 15.5 edition, the most recent update as of this video. Now, if you don't have Visual Studio 2017, I would recommend that you get it. If you go to visualstudio.com, you can download the Community Edition for free. The Community Edition is amazing. It's almost exactly the same as the Enterprise Edition, which is what I'm using. Now, the Enterprise Edition has a few features that you might want eventually, but really, that's like the upper 2% of what Visual Studio does. The other 98% and the stuff that really you're going to use every day, that's all free. So definitely go ahead and get 2017 if you can. Now I'm going to go to a new project and create a new project. I'm already here, but let's look where I am. I'm inside the Visual Studio section of the new project dialog. That's important because you might get into other languages like Visual Basic, which looks very, very similar in their layout, but you don't want Visual Basic. You definitely want Visual C#. So start there. But then that's a lot of project types to look at. So you can further refine it by going to Web, not Legacy, just Web. So inside the Web, you'll see probably two projects. You may have more or less, but the one you want is ASP.NET Web Application, and it's the .NET Framework. If we expand this out, you can see .NET Framework. Don't choose the .NET Core Web Application. That's for running on Linux or Mac OS using the .NET Core Framework. Now, that is a good option if you want to go that direction, but there's a lot more to learn there with what you can't do on the .NET Core platform. So we're not going to go there because the majority of the time when you're talking about running C#, especially in a business environment, we're talking about running on Windows. Now, C# works best with Microsoft SQL Server. That's not the only database server it can use. In fact, it's just one of hundreds it can use. But that's kind of like the peanut butter and jelly here. Typically, we see C# going hand in hand with SQL, Microsoft SQL. And Microsoft SQL, as of today, still only runs on Windows. Now, Microsoft is changing that. There is a version coming out soon for Linux, but that's not quite here yet. But for right now, Windows platform is more likely where you're going to spend most of your time. So we're going to go with a full .NET framework. It's a little easier to use, a lot easier to use actually, and it just takes away some of those barriers to entry. Once you get good with ASP.NET Web Applications in the .NET framework, you can switch over to .NET Core if you'd like to go that direction, and you can learn just those changes that come along with going to a .NET Core project. So all that to say, we're going to choose ASP.NET Web Applications .NET Framework. Now I'll give this a name. I'm going to call it my demo API, and the solution name, we'll call this Web API demo app. Now hit OK, and unlike other project types, we're not done yet. We have to make a couple more choices. So right now, since I chose Web API, it's going to default to that here. But really, there's more options. We have MVC, we have web forms, we have an empty project, single page application, Azure API, and Azure mobile app. Now we're going to choose Web API. And if you notice down below, we have some options. And because we chose Web API, we have MVC and Web API checked over here. And they're grayed out, meaning we can't uncheck them. So if we decide we want this option, we get by default MVC and Web API. Now we could add web forms if you like. Web forms is kind of the equivalent of WinForms, but for the web, and it's not something I'd recommend for most circumstances. Typically, that's a backward compatibility thing. We could also enable Docker support, which Docker is a container system that we're not going to cover in this video, but I'm sure we'll be covering in a future video. So we won't check that. And again, we won't check the unit tests. We're going to be doing a unit test. I'll be doing a unit test video pretty soon. But we're not going to cover it for this video because it really is outside the scope of what we're doing here. So right now we're getting Web API and MVC. And you may think, why are we getting both? And really for right now, what Microsoft has said is these two go hand in hand. And we're going to see how that works inside of our project. And really, I'm not complaining. I can see where eventually we won't have that anymore, but I think that'll be somewhat of a loss. There'll be somewhat of a feature or two missing if we don't have MVC added. But for right now, we do have them both here, so they'll both be selected, and that's fine. You could go to empty API and choose just Web API. We're not going to do that because that would change some things about how the template works. The next option we have over here is the change authentication. And this is outside the scope of this introductory video. But with Web API, we can add authentication so that we can kind of lock this down to only the people we want to have access, that we want to allow access to, or things like that. Now, it's really easy to select individual user accounts, and then inside the template, they'll add commented out sections for Facebook authentication, Twitter authentication, Google, Microsoft, and more. And it's really easy to implement, say, Twitter authentication, where a user can just say, log in with their Twitter credentials securely on Twitter, and it will give our application a token that says, this is Tim Corey, and we have authorized that, yes, that's who it is. And so that is a nice way of using somebody else's authentication system without having to roll your own. Now, there's also ways to hook up to Active Directory, even the Azure Active Directory, which is kind of nice, Office 365. You can even do Windows authentication if you're on intranet with this application. Not something I see used very often. Again, for this video, we'll be doing no authentication. So that's it. We have Web API. We have not checked anything else down here. We have not changed our authentication. So we have no authentication, no extra checkboxes. We hit OK. Now what's going to happen, if you notice the lower left-hand corner, it'll start adding NuGet packages. And so there's a lot of NuGet packages that get added right away that help build this template out. And that's a good thing, because that means this is really modular in how it's built. Once the page loads, or once the system loads, you'll see this page right here where we have some links you can go to help get more information about getting started, samples, tutorials, and more, as well as information about Azure. Azure is a great system, and they do give you some free credits, so I would definitely recommend checking that out. I will definitely have a video coming out soon that's going to cover Azure and what the benefits are and how to use it, because it essentially allows you to run your applications or parts of your applications in the cloud very, very easily. For example, just today I needed a SQL Server for a demo I was doing in class, and I had that SQL Server up and running in about 3 minutes. Now, if you've ever installed SQL Server locally or on a server, you know that just doesn't happen. It's not a 3-minute installation, it's more like a 3-hour installation sometimes. So it was definitely a really speedy process. So Azure is really a powerful thing. And then we have the add a service. You can kind of skip that. Now, there's other stuff here we're not going to cover yet. We'll come back to publishing in a little bit, but for now, we'll leave that alone. So this right here is our Web API as it comes default out of the gate. So it looks an awful lot like a ASP.NET MVC application, if you're familiar with one of those. Now, I do have a video on MVC, and that may be of help to you in kind of understanding some of these things, because I won't cover everything over again about MVC, because that's really outside the scope of this video. But some of these things you'll see are MVC, not API. Remember that this template loaded both MVC and API into this one project and kind of blended them together. So let's look at what is kind of API specific and what is MVC as well. So MVC, we're used to this home controller here in the controllers folder, and that's what powers a main page. And in fact, this is MVC. You can tell that because it inherits from the controller class. If it's an API, it inherits from the API controller class. So there's a difference right away. You can see this controller is an MVC controller. What that means is it has what's called a view. And a view is just a bit of HTML page, in this case it's right here. So this HTML represents the home index view, which in the home controller, the index method will load the index control or index view. All right, so, and then we have a shared layout. Like, this is MVC, so it's what we've already come to expect from MVC. So there's not really anything here yet that's API, except for, I kind of open up the values controller real quick. But that's really it as far as API specific so far. So before we go any further, I just want to launch this and just show you that, yes, in fact, it launches as as an ASP.NET MVC application. In fact, it'll look no different than the default MVC application. There you go. So if we kind of expand this window, there you go, that's the default application. The only difference is we see this link right here that says API. And if we click it, it's going to tell us that here's the API information. It may be a little hard to see, but we have an introduction to our API, and then we have 5 different actions that we can do on our API. There's the get action for just all the values. There's a get action for a specific ID of a value. There's a post of a values. There's a put of a specific value, and delete. Now, this is the first time when we have something API specific. It's not Web API specific, but just API in general. And APIs use HTTP protocols. That's the web protocol. And in web protocol, there are 4 different types of calls you can make. There's actually more than that, but there's four most common types. And they are get, post, put, and delete. Now you can think of these as similar to the CRUD actions. So create, read, update, and delete. Well, the create would be the post. That's where we create a new record or insert a new value. The read is the get. That's where we get information, essentially a select star from this table, or something like that. That'd be a get command. Then we have the update in the CRUD. So create, read, now update. Update is where we modify a record that already exists, and that's the equivalent to a put. So that's right here. The put is modifying this record with information. And finally, the delete is the delete. So we have create, read, update, delete. That's the equivalent of CRUD. Now, it's just to be clear, they're not exactly the same, but that's a really close analogy. So create, read, update, and delete. And that's our get, post, put, and delete. Actually, not in that order, but post, get, put, delete. There you go. So with API, we can call those 4 different types. Now, we're not used to calling those manually. When you go to a web page and type in the URL and hit enter, that's a get command. That's all we ever seem to do with browsers. So there's a whole lot more under the surface that we just don't do. Or at least we don't know that we're doing it. And so this is going to expose some of those other things that we can do, but it does mean that there's a little more complexity than just calling a URL in order to perform an action. So notice the API/values is the same URL for get as it is for post. That's because those 2 commands use the same URL, but they differ on protocol. And the get API/values/ID is the same for get, put, and delete. Again, the same URL, but different protocols. So we'll have to point those out and kind of identify where each of those is being used soon. But this right here, getting back to where you were, this is the page that loads whenever you call your URL, your website, in this case, localhost on port 61455. If you do a /help, it will give you all the different calls you can make to all the different API endpoints. These are called endpoints. So in this case, we have 5 already. So let's look at those 5, and we'll come back to this page and actually start making calls. So that was our layout and our index, which was both MVC. We're not going to deal with those, and we're not really going to deal with the home controller because that's, again, MVC and outside the scope of this video. What we are going to tackle is this values controller. Now, this values controller comes with kind of a starter kit or a starter example of how to use an API. And it's really kind of rough, meaning it's not doing anything real. It's just showing you this is how it would look or how it would work. So in this case, remember we had 2 different get calls. We had API/values and API/values/an ID. Well, they've put in comments here, that's the API/values call, and that's the API/values/ID call. And how do we know that those are the calls they are? Well, this method is called get, and this is an overload of get, and it takes in an ID. So WebAPI is using a naming structure that allows for some assumptions. The assumption is if you call your method get, then it's going to be a get command. If you call your method post, it will be a post command. Same with put and delete. Now, that may lock you into something that you're just not comfortable with, and that's okay. I will show you how to break out of that standard structure if you want to. Now, right now, we have this get API/values, and that gets all the values. In this case, it just returns a new string array with values 1 and 2. And that's all it expects is an IEnumerable of type string and returns those 2 strings. Whereas if we call API/values/a number, an ID, it returns just 1 value. Now note, it doesn't matter what the ID is, it just returns 1 string that says value. That's it. Post, put, and delete don't do anything. Okay, so we're going to tackle those in a little bit, but for right now, we're going to deal with just looking at this get. So let's launch this again and see how we can actually make a call to just the get portion of the API. Now, in the comments, and we'll figure out how to determine this on our own in a minute. But for right now in the comments, it says that the way to call this method, this one right here, is to say API/values. So let's do that. Let's say our URL /API/values. Now this is interesting. I typed value, not values. So it's singular, not plural. And we get this XML error. And it says, message, no HTTP resource was found that matches the request for this path. All right, so that's a message that we'll get if we call the wrong endpoint or the wrong place. So if I put values instead, now we get this array of string. String 1 is value 1, and string 2 is value 2. So remember, we were passing back just a new string array, value 1 and value 2. Now, if I were to pass in a number, let's just pass in a 2, so /2, that gives me back this string with a schema and then just value. Now, value is what we get when we call this API endpoint. Notice passing in an ID as well. And so it gives me back just the one value. So we do have some calls working to the API, but this adds a whole lot of overhead, and it's a little hard to see, and we can only make GET calls. So this right here, all the junk around, the schema and all the rest, even with Chrome, it's not the greatest. And that's where I want to introduce you to a new tool. Now, I just want to show you the tool. I'm not going to go in depth on how to use the tool and all the different features. That's a totally separate video. But I will at least introduce you to the tool because it's a really powerful tool to have in your toolbox, and it's free. So if you go to getpostman.com and download the version that works on your operating system, so it works on Mac, Windows, and Linux, I would assume since you're using Visual Studio that you want the Windows version. So you choose 32-bit or 64-bit and download that and install it. Once you do, you'll have this tool right here. Now, there's a lot of cool things this can do, including keep a history of what calls you've made so that you can remake that same call over again. You can also store a collection of calls in one chunk so that you can remember to call certain things all together if you're testing an API or something like that. But for right now, we're just going to deal with this section right here. Now notice, first of all, it says get here. And that's a drop down. And there are a lot of options here. But notice get, post, put, and delete. That kind of matches up with what we've already seen in our API over here. Get, post, put, and delete. So we can make a call. Let's do a get call for now. We're going to do the same call as up here. So let's even just copy and paste this. So I'll paste it in here, and then we do a send. So that's the URL. I hit send. Now notice what comes back. And let's see if we can't zoom in on this. There we go. So it has returned these values. It's an array, and it's value 1, value 2. So those two values there are what has been returned by the API. Now this is in JSON format. In the browser we saw XML format. Your API can return either, and typically it's smart enough to return the standard type or the type that you most likely want to see. In the browser it works with XML, but in most calls it's JSON, and that's great because that's what most applications are going to want to see is JSON. So JSON is just JavaScript object notation. Is all it stands for, and essentially what it means is it's a really simple format for creating objects or models. So it's really simple to do. In this case, this is an array, which got the square braces, and then the values separated by comma. So that's all there is to it. If I make this call again, but this time pass in an ID, and I do that, it gives me back just that one value. Notice it didn't do all of the array of string or the schema type and all the rest. You can get to that stuff. So there's the headers. There's all the good header information. In fact, there's more information here than there is normally, especially in the browser, if you kind of go hunt for it. You can also look at the raw value that comes back. You can preview it, make it pretty. You can change its type if you want and load it again. But for now, I think that JSON is all we really need. So that's the GET call to our API. Now I could very easily make a POST call. The problem is that right now nothing will happen because there is nothing to do. It's an empty method. Now we can change that in a little bit. We can change it to be something else. But for right now, we will come back here to our API and talk about how we actually get these routes. But that's kind of important to know how the route gets built so it's not just magic. So if you go over to your app_start and open that up, normally in MVC, there's 3 options in here, or 3 items in here: bundle config, filter config, and route config. But with Web API, there's a 4th, and that is Web API config. If we open this up, we'll see how the routes are defined. So it says the route for default API is API/controller/ID. All right, so the controller is, in this case, the values controller. So everything will be API/values in this values controller. So our get is just API/values, and it's using the get protocol versus the post versus the put. And it does have the optional ID. So that's how the routes are set up for API, especially compared to our default for the MVC, which this under route config looks very similar. It maps a route for default, which is controller/action/ID. And so it differentiates the two by saying, well, the Web API starts with API instead of the controller name. If you really wanted to, you could even change this to something else. So you could say, this doesn't have an API at the beginning, that the MVC one has a MVC/controller/action/ID. And you can swap those two around so the API doesn't have to say /API. But this is a pretty standard way of doing it, saying API/ and then whatever call you need to make. And it really tells everybody that this is an API. So that's, I would say leave it alone unless you really have a reason to change it. But that's the only thing that about API you need to know as far as how to change the default routing. That's it. So now, let's do this. Let's create our own controller, an API controller. So in controllers, I'm going to right click and say add new controller. I'm going to come down here and choose the Web API 2 controller. Now you have a few different options. You have the empty Web API 2 controller, which is essentially just a new class that inherits from API controller. Then you have the Web API controller with actions using Entity Framework. Not a fan of Entity Framework. We won't be covering that today. Web API 2 controller with read-write actions. That's very, very similar to what values controller is. And we have 2 more for OData, which we won't be covering. So really, I choose between these 2, the empty one and the read-write actions. So let's go with the one that has the read-write actions so we have something to start from. So we hit add. We're going to need to give it a name. And let's call this the people controller. This is all about people. So just like, in fact, it's identical to the values controller, but it sets everything up and it gives us our default routes. So API/people, API/people/5, or whatever ID you choose. And then it has all of our different options. Now, this is where people get a little kind of caught up or tied up in have to do things a certain way. And the biggest one out there is when you hear people say you have to create a RESTful API. And a Web API by default is a RESTful API. And what that means is it has certain ways of making calls that are logical in the way they're laid out, and certain things are true. So for example, when you say /people, you know you're going to make the get call for everything, a list of items. Where if you say API/people/ a number, that would get one person. And you know that every call that's a post is inserting new records, whereas a put is doing something different, and delete and all the rest. But here's the deal. I understand that's the goal to work towards. But be very careful that you don't get so caught up in the layout and the insistence on exactly perfect that you never finish. I would much rather see an API that in version 1 is a little rough, that you change for version 2 to make it a little better. Now, don't forget that once you start having applications use an API, it gets harder and harder to change that version 1. But that's okay. There's ways of versioning APIs so you can have 2 versions running at the same time. And that's okay. But the reason I'm saying all this is because I've seen a lot of people go down the RESTful API rabbit hole and just never come back. And the end result usually is they don't have a working API at all. I don't want to see that happen. So if it makes sense for your application to be a little less RESTful, a little more logical for you, that's okay. So if you decide, you know what, instead of having just 1 or 2 get calls in this controller, I'm going to have 5 with different names. That's okay if that's what works best in your organization or your application. So I'll show you a little bit of how to do that just so you're prepared. Just know that what I'm going to show you won't always totally line up with RESTful, and that's okay. All right, so getting back to our people controller, what we're going to want to have here is just a few commands. We're not going to do a put command. We're just going to do get one, post, and maybe delete. So let's take put entirely out. We won't worry about it. So now we have our get, post, and delete. We'll actually even change this post in a minute. But first, I need to have a model, a person model, because I'm not going to deal with just this generic new string and value 1, value 2. We're going to do a real API or a real-ish API. So in our models folder, let's right-click and say add a new class. And we'll say that our class name is person. And it's public. We're going to say string first name, and we'll set that equal to empty string to start with. Last name equal to empty string. And you know what? Let's go ahead and give it an ID as well. And we'll start that off at 0. We'll manually increment this. All right, so we have our person class model. If we come back over here, instead of IEnumerable, I just deal with, I like list better. I know list is a subset or a part of IEnumerable. It is an IEnumerable, but I like a list of person better. And since person is not in the list here, I do control dot to add the using statement for demo API dot models. So there we go. It's going to return a list of person. Now, that's not going to work here. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to create a list of type person, people equals new list of person up here in my class. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a constructor for this class that initializes people. Wow. If I can spell, people.add new person, and we'll say first name equals Tim, last name equals Corey, and ID equals 1. And we'll take that record and we're going to paste a couple more times, and we'll say Sue, Storm, and Bilbo Baggins. All right. So there are 3 people we're going to add. And now what we'll do is we'll just return people. So that returns our list of person. Now, let's just start right there, make sure it works. Once this starts up, all right. So now we do is say /API/ and it's people. And there we go. And in fact, we can take the same call and go over to our Postman, and notice the history right here, which is kind of nice. But we can paste this in, hit send, and now we have ID of 1. First name is Tim, last name is Corey, then Sue Storm, and then Bilbo Baggins, and 1, 2, and 3. So there we go. We've made our call, and it works by just saying API/people because we're following the same conventions of making a GET call. And let's change this as well. So we'll say people.where x equals greater than x.id double equals ID, first or default, and it returns a person, not a string. There we go. So now it should be, since I did this lookup here, it should be that when I pass an ID in, as long as it's in this range, if I pass an ID in and it's valid, it's going to find that user and return them. So let's start it up again. And I'll bring up my Postman again as well, since I closed that. All right. So /people/ remind me later, / let's do Bilbo. There you go. Bilbo Baggins, ID number 3. Let's do Sue. There's Sue. And if you want to try for me as well, there I am. So now we have an API that's actually making a call based upon the ID of the person that we're asking for. So we're asking for person number 3. It gives us Bilbo Baggins. Now, so far we're just dealing with demo data, but as you notice, this list of people and all the rest, this is essentially the product you get when you make a call to a database and load it into a list. So really, this is acting as if we're actually working with a database. So instead of just doing this lookup on a list, we'd actually go to a database and say, give me this ID. Now, and here's the thing that a lot of people get hung up on. They'll ask me, okay, that database access stuff is great, but how do I put that into, whatever user interface they want to use? And that's really the wrong question. And I don't blame people for asking, because I understand why you ask. But here's the deal. And that's what I talked about in the beginning. My favorite or the most important project type in C# is the class library project. The API is the second. Database calls shouldn't happen in the API or any user interface. They should happen in the class library. So at the API level, it doesn't matter what the database is or how you're talking to it. You would just be doing calls like this, where you say, pass back the list of people, limited by an ID or whatever. You wouldn't be doing anything where you're directly calling or talking to a database. You would say, my class library dot lookup people, and it would return a list of person, and you just pass that calls value back out to your API. So just don't get hung up on data access directly in API. You can do it. It'd work. I mean, it's C# code, so you can just plunk it right in as if it was your class library. Just don't do it. Put it in your class library. It makes your whole life easier. Just like create a web API makes your whole life easier when it comes to your business logic and data access, because it hides all that behind a layer that then anybody can talk to that layer and everything else is handled. All right. And that point going forward, there is no access to a database directly. It's all through the API. Now let's deal with the post, or actually saving data, putting data into our application. The first thing is they deal as from body and string and value. Here's what I'm going to do. Person, val. Okay. So I've just said that the posts will send in a person object. And now I can say people.add val. That's it. So now my post is done essentially. It just takes in a person object and adds that person to the people object. Now, in a real application, you'd want to do some testing on this to make sure it's a valid person. There's, all the information is populated the way you expect it to and that kind of stuff. But for right now, that's all we need to do. Now let's open that person object up. We have ID, first name, and last name. Okay. So let's run this. And we'll pull our Postman back up. And let's do a call. I can just click on this right here. And I'll do the call to people. And I see I have 3 people. Now let's change this to a post, still a people call. But in this time, I'm going to say raw. So I went to body over here. So I said in the body of the call, I'm going to go raw, and let's make it JSON format. And this is where the real power of Postman comes in. I can say, okay, I need an object. I can just come down here and start typing. Okay, so I'm going to type a JavaScript object, which JSON starts off with curly braces. But now I can say ID colon, look at ID number 4, first name colon, and then single quotes. And I'll say that, let's go with Mary, comma, last name colon, single quotes, Smith. So looks pretty familiar, pretty easy to do. Essentially, this just says this is an object or a model. Then here's all of my model names or properties. In this case, ID, first name, and last name. They match up with the properties in my people or person class. And then there's the values. And if it's a string, it goes inside single quotes. Otherwise, if it's a number, it's just a number. And it's a post command. And we're calling that same people. We hit send. And nothing comes back because we don't return anything. But if we go to our headers here, we'll see no serious problems here that I can see. So now we can do is go back and make that call. Let's expand that a little bit to people. The get call. We hit send. Nothing. We only have 3 people. So we're not quite sure why this isn't working, but it seems not to be in theory. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go over to our API, and we're going to put a breakpoint right inside of our post command. And now I come back over here, and again, this is the power of Postman. I can just go back to that command, the post command. Everything's still here. I hit send. Let's look at the value. If we can zoom in on this, it's Mary Smith and ID, so that all looks good. So now the people list, which people has 3. If we skip over it, now it has 4. And now let's put a breakpoint on our get call. And let's make that call. So the get people. Mouse over that, it still has 3. Now the reason for this is because this instance gets wiped out every time we make a new call. And that's something that makes it hard to do this kind of demo stuff. We have to actually save it to a text file. But what we have demonstrated is that we are actually bringing in people, a person object, by passing in that JSON object. It kind of maps it out based upon the names. So that would work, and if this was stored in a database instead of being initialized every time we instantiate, then we'd actually have a value long term. Unfortunately, like in this case, we can't do that because of the way Web API works, which is okay. That allows us to at least see what would have happened. The same thing is true here, where we could do, this right here, where we remove one person. So we'd say, oops, it's still running. People dot remove, and then we'd find the person by doing a people dot where, or we could do some other lookup magic for that. But in a real application, instead of making just remove it from a list, we'd probably call a database and say, delete this person. So, and pass in the ID. So that's how to set up a basic API and how to use it. Really easy. Like I said, the thing I love the most is I can just pass in this person object, even though I'm calling it via JSON. So I'm saying, okay, here's my JSON. And it just says, okay, I can map that out and put it in place. So in my get commands, they come back as JSON so that I have all the values I need. Oh, it's not actually running. That's why. No response means the server's down. Well, I'm not actually currently debugging, so that's why. But I can get the list of person. I can get that as JSON as well, so that my JavaScript can use it quite easily. So really easy to set up an API, really easy to get data going both directions. I recommend that when you start out simple. Just do a get command and a post command. Even if you do more in post than really you're supposed to, that's kind of okay. And I get it. Purists will argue with me that you gotta separate these things out, and let them argue with me. Okay? For you do what works and get the job done. It's more important to have code that ships than code that's perfect that never reaches the market. Okay? So the biggest ones are get and post. Now, one key difference here. In theory, you could actually store data by doing a get command. So essentially doing what post does, but doing it in a get command instead. The problem with that is that all the data, instead of being on the body, notice here for our post command, we put it on the body. We said here is the text or the stuff to put in the database, not in the URL. For get commands, we actually pass it in the URL. So if you want to pass in, say 10 parameters, the way you would do that is either you would set this route up with lots of slashes, or you would do the typical URL thing where you say ? and then say, first name equals Tim, ampersand, last name equals Corey, and so on and so forth. And so now there's your properties and your values. So if you do it this way with a get command, there's a few problems. First of all, if you have an ampersand in this value, you gotta escape it out. Otherwise, it's gonna think it's the next property. Second of all, the URL is limited to 2,000 characters, which sounds like a lot until you want to save a form's worth of data. Say, for example, you have a simple form that has it's a feedback form. Person's name, their email address, and their comments. Well, some people are going to put, nice job, great job, thanks, hated it, whatever, and their name and email address. No problem. But then some people will write a book. And a lot of websites will limit you to say, 5,000 characters. Well, if you max that out or get close to it or even to half of that, that's too much for the URL. Now, certain users won't be able to post or save their feedback. Some will, some won't. And you'll rack your brain trying to figure out why this won't work. The problem is get. You're using get when you shouldn't be. However, if you use post, those values come in the body. That doesn't touch the URL and the limitations thereon. Therefore, a post can, in effect, be unlimited. Now, there are limits, especially when it comes to uploading video or stuff like that. There's some problems if you get too big. But the reality is that's more a configuration issue than it is an actual limitation. Because obviously, YouTube, I upload gigabytes worth of video and it loads no problem. So that's all depends on your configuration, not on a limitation of the actual system. HTTP limits the URL to 2,000 characters. That's it, no more. So therefore, don't rely on get for sending data that you want to store. It's also a little more dangerous in the fact that get URL is visible even if you're on HTTPS. The problem with that is that URL, if it has form data, might have form data, say, of creating a new user, including that person's username and password. Not a good thing. Therefore, use post. Okay? That works on the body. It sends data via the body. And that is not visible when you're sending HTTPS. Okay, so the person couldn't sniff the body if using secure socket layer for your web transmission. So that's just a little bit of general advice that I've kind of bumped into a few times when I first started learning API, and even later I forget, and then I'll go, oh yeah, that's the reason why it's intermittently not working. The big one is if I'm trying to pass information in via get. Maybe it's something as simple as it makes sense to be a get, but it really shouldn't be. For example, if I was doing some kind of filter, maybe it makes sense to do a post, even though, I'm asking for information, but I'm sending in all these parameters. Okay, now I want to talk through a couple of different things that we can do to make this a little better. The first one is there may be a time when you don't want to do a get command or you want to have more than one get command. So for example, what if I wanted to have a public list of string called get first names? All right. So that method, I want to return a list of first names in a string. So I could do something like this. Right. Say, okay, let's do a list of string called output equals new list of string, and for each P in people, p dot, let's see, output dot add p dot first name. It's probably an easier way of doing that, but that's a pretty quick way of doing what I wanted. So I'm just going to loop through all the people in the list and just return the first names, Tim, Sue, Bilbo, and add that to a list of string, return that list of string. So I want a separate get call in my API in this controller, but it doesn't really fit the way things work. I don't have another get. So what do? How do you make this call in a way that makes sense? Now you could create a new controller called, people's first names controller, something weird like that, and have just one get command in it, and that does this. But that seems kind of silly. So what you can do is you can say, well, I'm going to specify what the route is. I'm going to say API slash people slash get first names. Okay, so now what I've done is I've overridden the default route. And I've said, this is a call to API slash people slash get first names. Now, normally it's just API slash people slash ID, and so forth. But in this case, I said, nope, this is the specific route that applies to this method. Now, because it kind of made sense, this matches this name. It doesn't have to. We could call this GFN for get first names. Doesn't matter. These two are no longer related. Where this one is an assumption that this is a get command, this is a HTTP get. Now, this route right here is specified with this command. Now, I also want to, at the same time, tell it what type of HTTP types I will accept. In this case, HTTP get. That's all I want. I could say get and post or patch or whatever, but I'm going to say just HTTP get. Notice you wanted to, you put a comma between them. So HTTP get is all I'm going to allow. But let's start this up and just see how it, see how it works, what the demo looks like. So we have people slash one instead of people slash one. I'm going to do people slash get first names. And the casing does not matter. So I hit send, and there is Tim, Sue, and Bilbo. So I've called that same controller, but with a custom path. Now I could even make this totally different. Don't do this, but I could say, I don't know, peeps. Let's actually stop it first. I could say peeps, which has nothing to do with the people controller. Okay? Just to demonstrate this actually would work, I'll show it, but don't do this. And the reason I say don't do this is because now you get to track down, notice get people first name, request is invalid, but if I now say peeps slash get first name, it comes back just fine. So again, don't do this. Always match your controller. So people controller, always have a slash, that name, so slash people, and then you can add anything you want afterwards. This will allow you to have more than one gettable call in the same controller. That can make sense for certain circumstances. And I'm not going to fault you for doing that. In fact, I encourage you, just get it done. Okay? Now, the other thing you can do with this is you can actually modify how this call is made to accept variables. Now, we've seen down below where it just assumes, since you're passing in one value, an ID. And that's a special case, the ID. You couldn't pass in other things. But up here, what I could say is, I don't want an ID. I want a user ID. That's the type int. Notice it's in curly braces. And I also want to slash age. That's also an int. So I have now, with these curly braces, I've said this call will have a user ID slash an age. And I could pass that in here, int user ID and int age. And now just to show that it works, I'll put a breakpoint here. I'm back to people, by the way. So we run this and we come back over to Postman. And it's going to be user ID and then age. So let's change it from peeps to people. And we're going to say user ID is 23 and age is 39. If we run this, it's going to pause here. We can mouse over this. User ID is 23, age is 39. So it pulled that off of our custom URL that said these are the values that'll be there and these are the types. And that matched that up with these parameters and it passed those values in. So that's a little bit more of an advanced use, but I want to show it off because that was something that kind of got me stumped for a while when I couldn't figure out quite what it was doing or why I was asking for this. I had to, figure out how to put those in. So that's kind of important to know if you need to pass in more than one value or different types of values and match them up with parameters. And again, this is how you change the name of your route if it does not match specifically the baked-in names that they gave us for API endpoints. So get, post, delete, or put. So I have now shown you how to change the route and how to specify what type of protocol to call. There's one more thing I want to show you before we're done, and that is if we launch this again, I want to show you one thing with the help context. Let's go to API. If you notice now we have people and values, which I think is really cool because now it shows us all the different endpoints we can call if we're the user. In fact, if we click on one, it shows us all this extra information, including how to make a sample call or what the response will be from a call. So in this case, the response they're expecting is sample string 1, sample string 2. Of course, you don't fill in real information because that'd be kind of silly, but it at least shows us what the structure will look like coming back. And that's really neat. But this could be better. Notice no documentation available. If we click on it, description, nothing. Additional information, nothing. So let's make this better. The place to start is to go to Properties and double click. If we go to the Build menu, we'll come down here and see XML documentation file. And right now it's set for the bin/demo-api.xml. We're going to change this to say that it's the app_data/documentation.xml. Remember, Microsoft loves XML files. Well, that's the documentation it's going to be in. It's XML. So we're going to put in app data. And that's what comes, notice a folder right here, app data, which is empty. That's what comes with an API. It's just part of the deployment package. So we're going to put in app data. We're going to call it documentation. We'll save this, but we're not done yet. We have to go to the areas folder, the help page folder, inside of app start. Now, most of the stuff we're not going to tackle. This is all stuff that Microsoft just sends with it by default. But in this help pages config, this is kind of awesome. If we scroll down here, we just need to uncomment one line of code. Uncomment both because they commented the comment. Whoops, wrong direction. There we go. Uncomment the following to use the documentation from XML documentation file. Okay, which is great. The one thing you need to change is the actual name. It does a tilde, which is the root of our project, /app data, that's that folder. But it says XML document.xml. Want to change that to just documentation.xml, which is the name we gave it over here, documentation.xml. So now that that's done, what will happen is every time you build the application, it's going to look for XML comments. These are XML comments. And it's going to take those and use those to help build our help file, which I think is just amazing. So let's go back to the people controller. And now notice that these green squigglies are everywhere. And that green squiggly says, hey, you don't have XML comments yet for this controller. So let's start with the people controller. This is where I give you all the information about my peeps. Okay, the comment doesn't matter. I just want to show you this is going to show up. All right. We won't comment the constructor, but we will comment the get first names. So I'll / here. And it's going to say, okay, how you want to describe get first names? Gets a list of the first names of all users. The unique identifier for this person. And we want to know how old they are. And it's going to return a list of first names. Duh. Okay, so there's an XML comment for just this one get call. I'm going to leave it right there. I will come over and comment our person class. Represents one specific person. And then the ID from SQL. User's first name. And let's get snarky in the last one and say, couldn't you guess? Okay, just so we have some comments and we know where those comments came from. So let's run this again. And I want to load that help file again just to show you the difference it makes. So API. Now, right away, you'll see people. This is where I give you all the information about my peeps. Well, that came from that comment on the people controller. Now let's look at the get command here. Instead of saying no documentation, it says gets a list of the first names of all users. Again, the documentation over this method. If I open it up, it says the user ID is a unique identifier for this person. And the age, we want to know how old they are. And the resource description, a list of first names. Duh. All right. So here's all the information it tells us about what's going to happen. Okay. It gives us a whole lot of information about these people, this data. All right. So now when in the post, when it says, here's the 3 things I need ID, first name, and last name. It says the ID is the ID from SQL. The first name is the user's first name, and the last name is, couldn't you guess? Okay, so this documentation has now been built using the comments directly in our code. I think that's pretty impressive because right out of the gate, you have a system for documenting your API that will help users actually use your application user interface. So with that being said, there are better help documentation systems out there, but a lot of them will use these same comments. And so you don't have to, scrap your documentation and start over. The thing I love about this is that your documentation is right next to your code. You don't have to go somewhere else and remember to put a section in there and fill it all out properly. That's important because it's more likely to happen. So I recommend you use the / comments and that you turn on that help documentation. All right, last piece of information you need to know. If we just run this application, you can actually run this from your PC and even open up a port in the firewall, and you can have other PCs talk to your PC and call this API. That's great for demos, but how do you actually deploy this to a web server? You don't just copy and paste. What you do, you right-click on your project, and you're going to come down here to Publish. And you have some options. You can go to Azure. That's really easy. You can say Create New and just Publish, and it will create a new place in Azure. You can FTP or send it to IIS like this, or you can do a folder. So let's just do a folder, and we'll do it in the bin/release/publish output. And we'll say Done. And now notice that it says Publish has been successful. So if we were to right-click on Demo API, open Folder in File Explorer, go to our bin, go to our release, and go to Publish Output, this we can just copy and paste into any IIS project or point IIS to this folder, and it will run our Web API. Done. That's it. So we just grab this, copy and paste, and we're good to go. Notice this is not the same thing as this. Totally different. This is the uncompiled raw stuff. The stuff we have inside of release, publish, output, that stuff is the compiled code, or at least the bundled up stuff, and is designed to be put in a web server. So that's a really easy way to do the publish. But also notice you come back here and go to our publish again. We create a new profile. We can also do continuous, and let's go back and close this out and see if we can't get that back. If we do publish, we can also automatically publish your application to Azure with continuous delivery. That means that every time you, I believe it's every time you build, it'll actually send that build to Azure and update it. And that's a great way for testing with a team, because they can all see your latest changes right away. I don't do that in my work environment. We do use Web API, but instead what we do is every time we push code to Git, so every time in Git we say, commit to the master branch, it builds that using Visual Studio Online. And so that push to master kicks off that development build. And we do same thing with other branches as well. So if we push to the release branch, it will build the release version of the API. And that's a little more advanced and uses some build and deployment tools. But this simple folder profile publish, really simple. Then you can FTP those files wherever you need to go. Okay. Or delivery to Azure. If you're using Azure, this is so simple. You just say, hey, go to Azure, and it just does it, and it just works. So publishing, not that difficult. It's just not a copy the bin folder by itself. You actually got to publish to a folder and then take that folder's contents. So that's it. That's Web API. Who can use this? Pretty much anybody. Browsers can use this. You can have your apps, mobile, iOS, Android, Windows Phone while it's still around. They can all use the API. So can Java, Ruby, JavaScript, C# directly. There's so many others you can use. Any kind of tool you need pretty much can use a Web API. This is a great way to have some separation of concerns and have a way to have a system that is pretty much unchanging the back end, even if the front end changes all the time. And it makes those front end changes so much easier to do. So Web API, definitely something you should delve into more. Now we've just scratched the surface of what Web API can do and how to use it. There'll be more videos in the future on how to do more with this, but I want to get you introduced to this, and I definitely recommend that you create a few APIs just to try stuff out and see how it works. All right, thanks for watching. As always, I am Tim Corey, and I'd really appreciate it if you could give me a thumbs up if you like this video, and leave a comment with any suggestions for new videos or what you thought of this video. All right, thanks for watching. We'll see you.